The night shift, often called the graveyard shift, has a strange way of warping reality. When the world sleeps, the darkness reveals what the daylight keeps hidden. For 6 unsuspecting souls, what began as an ordinary night on the job became something they'd never forget. These are their stories. Chilling accounts of terror that unfolded in the dead of night. Story number 1. The Phantom of Ridgefield General. Ridgefield General Hospital had always been a haven of whispers. Its long, sterile corridors and faint scent of antiseptic masked the eerie stories that seemed to pass like folklore among the staff. Clara, a newly hired nurse, dismissed the tales as nothing more than stress-induced paranoia. Her shift began at 10 p.m., and by midnight, the hospital was eerily silent, save for the occasional hum of machines and the soft shuffle of slippers on linoleum floors. Clara was assigned to the West Wing, an area known among staff as the Silent Hall. It housed long-term patients, most of whom were comatose or barely responsive. As she checked her clipboard, a patient's monitor began to beep irregularly. Clara hurried into the room. The patient, an elderly man named Mr. Hensley, had been comatose for years. His vitals were stable, but his eyes, once lifeless, were now wide open, staring directly at Clara. "Mr. Hensley?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond but slowly raised his hand, pointing towards the window. The blinds rattled slightly, though there was no breeze. Clara's throat tightened as she approached the window. Pulling the blinds aside, she saw nothing but the parking lot below, bathed in dim orange light. When she turned back, the bed was empty. Heart pounding, she rushed to the hallway, expecting to find him wandering. Instead, the corridor was empty. She checked every room, her panic growing, until she reached the end of the hall. There, by the emergency exit, she found Mr. Hensley standing impossibly upright for a man who hadn't walked in years. "Mr. Hensley, you can't be here," Clara said, her voice shaking. He turned his head slowly, his eyes hollow and dark. "He's coming for you," he rasped before collapsing to the floor. The lights flickered, plunging the hallway into darkness. When they came back on, Mr. Hensley was back in his bed, the monitors beeping steadily as though he'd never left. Clara's legs buckled, her breath ragged. For the rest of the night, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She later discovered that Mr. Hensley's room was the site of a nurse's death years earlier. Found by the window, her face frozen in terror. Story number 2. The Gas Station Shadow. Eli hated working the late shift at Parker's Gas and Convenience. The tiny, roadside station was a magnet for strange travelers, and the hours dragged endlessly. But it was a job, and jobs were hard to come by in their sleepy town. It was a little after 2 a.m. when the bell above the door jingled. Eli looked up from his phone to see a man in a long coat standing by the entrance. The stranger didn't approach the counter or browse the aisles. He simply stood there, motionless, staring at Eli with unsettling intensity. "Can I help you?" Eli called out, his voice faltering. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly raised a hand and pointed toward the security cameras. Confused, Eli glanced at the monitors. The cameras showed the empty aisles, the parking lot, and the front door. The man wasn't there. Eli's stomach turned as he looked back at the entrance. The man in the coat was gone, replaced by the faint sound of footsteps behind him. Whirling around, he saw nothing but rows of snacks and beverages. The bell jingled again. Eli turned back to the door and gasped. The man was back, standing closer now, his face partially illuminated. His eyes were sunken, and his smile stretched too wide to be human. Frantically, Eli grabbed his phone to call the police, but the screen was filled with static. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped. Behind him, he heard a faint whisper. "Leave." Terrified, Eli bolted for the back office and locked the door. The whispers grew louder, scratching at his sanity. Suddenly, the office door rattled violently as if someone, or something, was trying to break in. Eli grabbed a metal rod and prepared to defend himself. But when the rattling stopped, he hesitated. Opening the door cautiously, he found the gas station eerily quiet and empty. On the counter, however, was a crumpled piece of paper with a single word scrawled in crimson ink. "Run." The next morning, Eli quit his job, but the nightmares followed him. To this day, he wonders if he left in time, or if the man in the coat is still waiting for him. Story number 3. The Warehouse Wraith. In a small industrial town, a warehouse sat at the edge of the city, abandoned and decaying. Jeremy, a security guard struggling to make ends meet, was hired to keep vandals out during the night shift. The pay was decent, but the isolation was suffocating. The warehouse was cavernous, its dark corners swallowing the dim light from Jeremy's flashlight. He had a routine: walk the perimeter, check the loading docks, and return to his small office. It was monotonous but manageable. On his second night, Jeremy noticed something strange. A faint, echoing sound, like soft footsteps, followed him as he made his rounds. Stopping to listen, he shined his flashlight into the darkness. The beam caught a fleeting glimpse of something. A shadow that moved unnaturally fast. "Hello," Jeremy called, his voice trembling. No response. By the third night, the sounds grew louder. Footsteps, whispers, even faint laughter. Jeremy tried to convince himself it was his imagination until he saw it. A figure standing on the far end of the loading dock, its head cocked unnaturally to the side. "Who's there?" he shouted, but the figure didn't move. Gripping his flashlight like a weapon, Jeremy cautiously approached. But as he got closer, the figure vanished, leaving only the faint scent of decay. That night, Jeremy set up his phone to record as he patrolled. Reviewing the footage, his heart sank. There it was, the shadowy figure, following him at a distance, its face pale and featureless. On his final shift, Jeremy found a message carved into the wall near his office. "You're not alone." Unable to bear the mounting dread, he quit the next morning. The warehouse was later demolished, but workers claimed to hear whispers in the rubble, as if the wraith refused to leave. Story number 4. The Basement Bell. Madeline had been working as a night custodian at a historic hotel for 3 years. The Grand Bellwood was once a luxurious destination for the wealthy, but had since fallen into disrepair. Its ornate architecture was now cloaked in dust, and most of the rooms were unoccupied. Madeline's shifts were solitary, her only company the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the old building. The work was uneventful, except for one rule: never enter the basement alone. "Why not?" she had asked her manager when she was hired. He'd shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Just don't. Trust me." One night, as she mopped the marble floors of the lobby, a faint ringing echoed through the building. It sounded like an old-fashioned bell, high-pitched and uneven. Madeline froze. Listening. The sound was coming from the basement. She hesitated, her manager's warning playing in her mind. But curiosity gnawed at her. Gripping her flashlight tightly, she descended the narrow staircase. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of damp earth filled her nostrils. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a dimly lit storage room, filled with forgotten furniture and cobweb-covered trunks. The bell rang again, louder this time. It was coming from a door at the far end of the room. Madeline approached cautiously, her heart pounding. The door creaked open with a gentle push, revealing a smaller room. In the center stood a brass bell on a wooden stand, tarnished but still gleaming faintly. She reached out to touch it when the door slammed shut behind her. The temperature plummeted, and a whispering chorus filled the air. "Ring it," the voices urged. Terrified, Madeline backed away. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The bell rang again on its own, sending a jarring vibration through the room. The whispers turned into screams. Suddenly, the room seemed to collapse around her. The walls warped, revealing shadowy figures clawing their way toward her. She screamed, pounding on the door until it flew open. Stumbling into the storage room, she looked back. The small room and the bell were gone. Madeline quit the next day, but her nights remained haunted by the sound of that bell. The Grand Bellwood was eventually condemned, but some say you can still hear faint ringing if you walk past it late at night. Story number 5. The Midnight Mechanic. Danny worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour auto repair shop on the outskirts of town. The job was lonely but paid well, and most nights were quiet, with only the occasional stranded driver stopping by. One stormy night, Danny was halfway through an oil change when he heard the sound of a car pulling into the lot. Wiping his hands on a rag, he stepped outside to find an old battered station wagon idling near the garage door. The driver, a woman in her 40s, rolled down her window slightly. "Can you take a look? It's making a strange noise," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. Danny nodded and motioned for her to pull into the garage. But as the car passed under the flickering overhead light, he noticed something unsettling. The passenger seat was empty, yet the window was fogged, as if someone had been breathing on it. Shaking off the unease, Danny began his inspection. The engine seemed fine, but the strange noise continued, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't coming from the car. It was coming from behind him. Spinning around, Danny saw nothing but shadows. The growling stopped, replaced by faint scratching sounds. "Do you hear that?" he called to the driver, but she didn't respond. When he leaned into the car, he found it empty. The woman was gone, and the driver's seat was soaked, as though she had been sitting in a puddle. The scratching grew louder, echoing through the garage. Danny grabbed a wrench, his pulse racing. The sound was coming from the back of the station wagon. He hesitated, then slowly opened the trunk. Inside was a mound of wet leaves and something else. A single sodden shoe. The garage lights flickered and went out. In the darkness, Danny heard a whisper, cold and clear. "You shouldn't have opened it." The lights came back on, and the car was gone. Danny never saw it leave, nor did he see the woman again. The next morning, he found a set of wet footprints leading from the garage to the woods beyond. Story number 6. The Tunnel Keeper. The city's subway system was a labyrinth of tunnels, some abandoned, others still in use. Rebecca, a night maintenance worker, was tasked with inspecting the tracks and ensuring everything was in working order before the first trains of the morning. Her shifts were uneventful until one particular night when her flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something unusual. In the distance, just beyond the tracks, she saw a figure standing perfectly still. "Hey! You're not supposed to be here," she called out. The figure didn't move. Rebecca's flashlight flickered, and when it stabilized, the figure was gone. Shaking her head, she chalked it up to exhaustion and continued her rounds. But as she moved deeper into the tunnels, the air grew heavier, the darkness more oppressive. Then she heard it, a low rhythmic tapping sound, like metal on stone. It echoed eerily, coming closer and closer. Rounding a bend, she saw the figure again, this time crouched by the tracks. It looked up at her, its face pale and eyeless, its mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. Rebecca froze, unable to scream. The figure rose and began walking toward her, the tapping sound following its every step. Panicking, she turned and ran, her footsteps pounding against the tunnel floor. The tapping grew louder, faster. She stumbled but managed to scramble to an access ladder. Climbing frantically, she reached the surface and slammed the hatch shut behind her. The police found no one in the tunnels, but Rebecca refused to return. She later learned that the tunnel she'd been working in was abandoned decades ago after a worker was killed in a freak accident. His body was never recovered. The night shift is a time when the ordinary becomes extraordinary, and the shadows come alive with unspeakable horrors. For Clara, Eli, and Jeremy, these weren't just stories. They were encounters that left an indelible mark on their lives. Now the question remains, could you endure the terrors lurking in the dead of night? Or would you become another tale whispered among those brave enough to take the graveyard shift?